Good afternoon. My name is Mathias Risse, and I'm the director of the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy. And it is my pleasure, also on behalf of my colleague Sushma Raman, to welcome our two distinguished speakers and you, our audience, to this episode in our series on the fierce urgency of now. On a weekly basis, the series addresses challenges that one way or another are matters of economic justice at the intersection to racial justice. Now, not only is the title of our series a quote from Martin Luther King Jr., but one could hardly think of a figure more central to this intersection between economic and racial justice than Martin Luther King, though I hasten to add that the radical ways in which he stood also for economic justice are still widely underappreciated. It is much to the credit of one of our speakers today that this important component of his work and the theoretical depth at which he substantiated his views on economic justice are receiving more attention. King, of course, was a Christian minister who became the most visible leader in the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s, and ultimately paid with his life for his outspoken stances on April 4th, 1968. Everybody knows that King stood for advancing civil rights through nonviolence and civil disobedience, but he also stood for far-reaching economic reform, insisting on meaningful jobs at a living wage, a secure and adequate income for all unable to find or do a job, as well as access to land or capital for the poor. And to make all that happen, he also insisted on the ability of ordinary people to play a significant role in government. One of his guiding maxims was that nobody should live in poverty while others would live in luxury. He did not hold back in expressing deep frustration with the white majority, especially white liberals, for not pushing the government to support disadvantaged Black communities. But he also thought that with the right kind of approach, broad parts of the population would eventually feel compelled to engage with the moral arguments he was advancing. He never lost hope that eventually people could no longer in good conscience tolerate the deep injustices all around them, and that it would not take revolutionary change or a full separation from whites to get to a just society, but that instead that it could happen from within society. In his activist work, King tried to find common ground with labor unions and thus bring together racial and economic justice. But he also often found that white unionists, at a time when unions were rather powerful, especially in the South, were unwilling to support racial justice, whereas Black activists would not want to get involved if racial justice wasn't front and center to the efforts. Our topic today is "The King is Dead, Long Live the King, Rethinking Martin Luther King Jr.'s Legacy in the Era of Black Lives Matter." And our speakers will soon explain the wording of this title. It is now my pleasure to welcome Jason Lee and Brandon Terry, both of whom very much continue the work that Martin Luther King did, especially at this intersection of racial and economic justice, and then especially also at this juncture to work between Black political organizing and union organizing. Jason Lee is an organizer, political and digital strategist, and essayist with years of experience in organized labor, progressive politics, and Black social movements. He is currently the CEO and founder of We Are, a Black-owned new media consultancy, and formerly the political director for United Working Families. And that is an independent political organization based in Chicago, where he's also based, that was founded and backed by progressive labor unions. United Working Families is dedicated to giving a political voice to working people in Illinois, and it does that by recruiting and training political candidates and organizers, and by directly engaging in community organizing. United Working Families is also an affiliate of the Working Families Party, which in turn is a grassroots political party that operates in a number of states across the nation. Brandon Terry, our second speaker, actually he will be the one to go first. Brandon Terry is Assistant Professor of African and African American Studies and Social Studies here at Harvard University. He is a scholar of African American political thought, political philosophy, and race, politics, and culture, And he has contributed enormously to a recent reevaluation of Martin Luther King's systematic thought to make us see that King has much to offer in systematic philosophical support of his soaring oratory and quotable phrases. He has done this work in two edited volumes that both appeared in 2018. And he's also an active contributor to public debate and has provided insightful commentary for a number of news outlets. And in 2017, Brandon and Jason also co-authored an essay entitled Rethinking the Problem of Alliance, Organized Labor and Black Political Life, which investigates what potential there is in alliances between unions and Black advocacy organizations in the era of Trump, and thus brought their respective lines of work together. We are thrilled to have the two of you with us today. So what I'll do now, I will hand over to Brandon, who will speak to us first. Brandon will then hand over to Jason. They will together speak for about 30 minutes. And you, during that time, while they're speaking, should also already put down your questions in the YouTube channel. And then at the end, my colleague Sushma Raman will take over and moderate the Q&A session. Over to you, Brandon.
Thank you, Mathias, and for inviting me, and thank you, Sushma, for organizing and moderating the debate, and thank you all for attending. It means a lot that you're here. When Martin Luther King Jr. was murdered on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee, by the white supremacist James Earl Ray, he was killed in the line of duty, so to speak. He was showing solidarity there with Memphis's Black sanitation workers. And these workers were striking not only because, like many full-time service and warehouse workers today, they labored at wages that left them dependent on food stamps to make ends meet, but they were also striking because of the contemptuous danger and disregard shown to them by the city. Two of their colleagues, Echo Cole and Robert Walker, were crushed in the malfunctioning, garbage-strewn maw of their sanitation truck. Black sanitation workers were frequently forced in inclement weather to seek refuge because white neighborhoods would not let them make safe shelter stops from the storm. The union had long pleaded for the trucks to be repaired and workers to be better compensated, but Memphis's segregationist and anti-union mayor, Henry Loeb, prioritized instead municipal funds for the beautification of already wealthy neighborhoods. Indeed, because Cole and Walker were officially listed as hourly employees rather than salaried ones, in a mark of early casualization, their families were deemed ineligible for workers' compensation and instead received meager ad hoc bereavement payouts of $500 per man. These were summary judgments meant to mark the negligible market value of a precarious caste and hopefully quiet the righteous indignation of their colleagues. Many of the key threads of Martin Luther King's most pressing concerns with economic justice come together in this tragedy of Memphis. The irrational sorting of social wealth, the intersection of racial and economic oppression, the repression of labor and the baldly coercive character of low-wage work and structural unemployment, and the iconic signs that were carried by Memphis's sanitation workers, "I am a man." We see too the resistance to the kind of recognition disrespect that underwrites the denial of any opportunity to make empowered decisions about our civic and economic life in common. So often, King complained in 1968, we overlook the work and the significance of those who are not in the professional jobs, of those who are not in the so-called big jobs. Against this order of values, King insisted that whenever you are engaged in work that serves humanity and is for the building of humanity, it has dignity and it has worth. King imagined a world where all forms of socially necessary labor could be performed with self-respect and recognition in a truly cooperative society. One day, King warned in a claim that sounds prophetic in our time of pandemic, our society will come to respect the sanitation worker if it is to survive. For the person who picks up our garbage in the final analysis is as significant as the physician. For if he doesn't do his job, diseases are rampant. All labor has dignity. We are now, it is clear, a long way from this ideal. While many high-income workers have withdrawn into social distancing, Amazon warehouse employees, postal and delivery service workers, grocery store clerks, restaurant workers, janitors, public work staff, childcare providers, and of course, sanitation workers are all being asked to continue making our collective life and comfort possible. That they do this at great risk to themselves and their families is hardly appreciated and much less rewarded. At times, King sought to link our inability to recognize the dignity of such work and the people who performed it to forms of reification and ideology that we've inherited from our sordid history of chattel slavery. In his last presidential address to his Southern Christian Leadership Conference in 1967, King insisted that a nation that will keep people in slavery for 244 years will thingify them and make them things. And therefore they will exploit them and poor people generally economically. This kind of argument reflects King's thought that the corrosive effect of rampant capitalism and unrestrained militarism on the moral priorities and economic practices of our nation were devastating. Our very attributions of value and priority, he thought, reflect the ways we treat our fellows more like objects, things, or commodities than equal persons. And these forms of treatment are not just attitudes, they're embedded in and overdetermined by social structures which constantly present such relations as natural, inevitable, and rational. These are long-standing concerns in King's thought, not simply part of some radical turn in the late 1960s. In seminary writings from the late 1940s, King predicted that a resurgent labor movement and the nationalization of industry in the United States would bring about the end of capitalism because, he said, it had failed to meet the needs of the masses. In one of his love letters to Coretta Scott in 1952, King even dispenses with his romantic come-ons to go on a long aside concerning Marxism. And in that love letter, he declares, "I am much more socialistic in my economic theory than capitalistic." In an early sermon from his book, Strength to Love, the first book of sermons ever published by a Black author for a broad American audience, King charged that capitalism has often left a gulf between superfluous wealth and abject poverty, has created conditions permitting necessities to be taken from the many to give luxuries to the few, and has encouraged small-hearted men to become cold and conscienceless. King even extended this criticism at times to the notion of value undergirding capitalism itself. The profit motive, King warned, when it is the sole basis of an economic system, encourages a cutthroat competition and selfish ambition that inspires men to be more concerned about making a living than making a life. It can make men so I-centered that they are no longer thou-centered. It is King's persistent raising of the fundamental question of value, his ambivalence concerning our ruling notions of labor and reward, and his emphasis that a revolution in values demands profound institutional, habitual, and associational changes that make him an important interlocutor for today's revivalism around democratic socialism. Democratic socialists argue that under capitalism, the extraction of surplus value from wage labor is the definitive end of our economic life in common. Even wage workers and recipients of social welfare remain dependent on the continued growth of capital wealth in order to make a living. This constrains the horizons of what democratic contestation can even entail, and makes it seem like our debates don't touch the most vital issues of the age. For political democracy to be actual, for us to be able to actually negotiate the form of our life together, as the philosopher Martin Hagelin writes, the purpose and practice of our economy must itself be a matter of our democratic deliberation. As the great Black intellectual W.E.B. Du Bois complained in 1920, matters of work and wealth are, as it stands, strictly controlled by elites, and not sufficiently matters of free discussion and determination. For instance, As the profit motive of capitalism pushes toward more refined and efficient means of exploiting labor and technological innovation, the resulting productivity gains have actually lowered the amount of socially necessary labor it takes for our society to reproduce itself. The free time resulting from these efficiencies, however, appear to us not as free time, but as pathology, the purported cultural resistance to work amongst the ghetto poor, or a problem of structural unemployment. Instead of these pathologies, we do not see this advance in free time as a chance to reevaluate the purposes to which the freedom afforded by social cooperation might be put. This is the kind of thing King means when he says that he's not interested in just putting people to work in any remunerative job by any means necessary. Instead, he wants to expand what he called the realm of freedom. The work which improves the condition of mankind, the work that extends knowledge and increases power and enriches literature and elevates thought, King declares, is not done to secure a living. It is not, he says, the work of slaves driven to their tasks, either by the taskmaster, or by animal necessity. It is the work of men who somehow find a form of work that brings a security for its own sake and a state of society where want is abolished. It is a question of dignity, King insists, as he defends guaranteed income and other egalitarian measures, that the decisions concerning one's life are in his own hands when he has the means to seek self-improvement. So given these views, existing pictures of King as a civil rights leader narrowly construed are radically misleading. King always argued that merely formal rights could never amount to genuine freedom and equality in a capitalist society. In his 1964 book, Why We Can't Wait, King wrote that Negroes must not only have the right to go into any establishment open to the public, but they must also be absorbed into our economic system in such a manner that they can afford to exercise that right. What does it profit a man, King asked, to be able to eat at an integrated lunch counter if he doesn't earn enough money to buy a hamburger and a cup of coffee? When we think about what King thought such absorption demanded, it seems quite radical. My colleague, the brilliant philosopher Tommy Shelby, zeroes in on 4 principles of economic justice elaborated over King's mature writings. The first is that no one should live in poverty in the midst of affluence. King is repulsed by the juxtaposition of profound wealth and degrading poverty in America. Such poverty has no justification in our age, King declared, and in an era whose wealth inequality is dwarfed by our own. He says that an economic system that imposes deprivation upon fellow persons in the midst of affluence is as cruel and blind as the practice of cannibalism at the dawn of civilization. The second principle that King holds is that individuals should be equipped with the material means to take full advantage of their formal freedom. King shares the longstanding left-wing critique of merely formal rights that are not buttressed by social cooperation and shared wealth. Third, King believes that the miracles of productivity should benefit all mankind rather than just the owners of capital, right? The development of self-driving cars and the benefits of transportation infrastructure should not just accrue to the owners of Uber or Lyft, they should accrue to the broader society. Lastly, in Tommy's view, the true economic democracy would mean something like labor's parity of power with capital. King often emphasizes the victory of labor unions, not just as successes for their members, as we tend to think of labor organizing now, but as profoundly triumphant moments in the history of democracy. But to these 4 principles, I would add a 5th. And it's King's view that economic arrangements should be subject to democratic contestation and decision-making, including even nonviolent direct action, dedicated venues for civic participation and contestation, and even formal community arbitration around issues of labor and racial justice. For King, the most important and recurrent lesson of American history was that civil rights and equality are perpetually vulnerable to erosion without vigilant civic action, including boycott, protest, and civil disobedience. By the late 1960s, for instance, King became an avid public champion of the work led by the National Welfare Rights Organization and celebrated the development of welfare and tenants unions as a significant moment, again, not just for its immediate beneficiaries, but in the history of democracy. Invoking the work that tenants unions and welfare unions were doing in the late 1960s to organize public housing residents and welfare recipients, King argues that these groups are generating new methods of participation and decision-making that could help bring about a genuinely democratic society. In King's ideal, therefore, the value of housing, the ownership of utilities, the connection between work and wages would all be subjected not just to democratic deliberation, but the forceful contestatory action of the citizenry. Empowering everyday people, King thought, was even more pressing in light of the economic dislocations caused by automation and the offshoring of jobs and the assault on labor organizing in the mid-20th century. In King's last address to the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, he looks beyond his longstanding interest in labor to emphasize organizing even those most dislocated by unemployment and structural changes of late 20th century capitalism. Race, of course, looms largely over these concerns. One of King's interests in the unmasking of racist ideology stemmed from his sense that it was racism that allowed for the mystification of structural disadvantage as pathology and continuously undermined possible solidarities between ordinary folks to expand democracy. Race also exacerbated the kinds of disadvantage faced by African Americans. The cumulative centuries-long foundation of economic inequality through slavery, Jim Crow, and ghettoization is partly why the civil rights revolution of the 1960s had a limited impact on the poorest African Americans, as King predicted. On the one hand, due to the efforts of civil rights activists and their allies, unions are more inclusive, anti-discrimination law more effective, and affirmative action, integration, and minority set-asides have helped create a much larger Black middle class and an unprecedented Black elite. At the same time, however, the collapse of American manufacturing, the persistent inequality of American education, and the difficulties of life in ghetto neighborhoods has trapped roughly 1 in 5 African Americans and 36% of Black children below the meager standard we euphemistically call the poverty line. Worse, all statistics that you hear on Black poverty will underestimate that poverty's severity simply because they exclude the roughly 2 million Americans and 500,000 African Americans currently incarcerated. There has been bipartisan resistance in the wake of the Great Society to nearly any public policy measure explicitly designed to repair the massive scale of accumulated Black disadvantage, even in the worst off neighborhoods. American politics from Nixon until the present may be seen as an extended rebuke to the economic agenda of activists like King and the bipartisan group of politicians who once spoke of a federally mandated full employment plan or a Marshall Plan for the cities and the empowerment of poor people through basic income and participation in government. Instead of these dreams, these freedom dreams, there has been a tragic attempt to treat the social ills of capitalism and racism with incarceration and other punitive forms of social control. While this punitive approach had some impact on reducing crime, it has also been widely acknowledged now as a profound moral and political failure that has disproportionately harmed people of color. Not only does incarceration entrench unemployment, family fragility, poverty, and disease, it also stigmatizes the broader racial group. This racial stigma spills over into wealth inequality and economic vulnerabilities located in the housing market. Partly due to the racial stigmas of crime and disorder, the very fact of a neighborhood being primarily Black is highly correlated with predatory lending, foreclosures, and stubbornly low recovery of property values. One of the knottiest problems that scholars are working through in the study of race and capitalism is just how tightly tied the value of housing is with the perceived value of racial proximity. Yet, as Adolph Reed has recently argued, differences in income may still be the ultimate long-term driver of wealth inequality. And this is why it matters that the American economy has been characterized over the past 3 decades by the decimation of labor unions, stagnant wages, and the explosion of casual and contract labor with weaker benefits and security. We've seen a radical unmooring of firm productivity and worker compensation. And Blacks, who've also just been burdened by discrimination, have been disproportionately located in the areas of the labor market susceptible to these changes. And this has really helped entrench the wealth gap in the present. Now, these were not King's circumstances. Things have changed since he was alive, but he teaches us that any consideration of our social circumstances must not be posed in isolation from the moral question of the basic fairness of the benefits and burdens of a cooperative society. If we proceed unreflectively without putting these moral questions at the forefront, we fail on 2 fronts. First, we fail to think critically and creatively about the structural, political, and economic constraints in which practices like public safety, education, and criminal justice are embedded. We take far too much of our society's background disadvantages as given, and yet consider ourselves surprised when our programs have limited impact or are met with resentment by their intended beneficiaries. Second, as my good friend Jason Lee will talk about, we suffer from a failure of imagination. We do not have to take our institutions in their current forms for granted. We can pose the question, we can ask, we must ask, what are they for? What role might the police, the military, the corporate firm, the university play in a society that would really, in King's sense, be worth the allegiance of even the least of these? Turn it over to you, Jason.
Thank you, Brandon. First, I want to thank the Carr Center for allowing me to share some thoughts and dialogue with everyone who is participating today. It's always good to be back, even virtually at Harvard. And, Brandon, I really appreciate those remarks and over a decade of friendship and collaboration. Although next time you should let me go first. It's always tough to follow someone as brilliant as Brandon Terry. Unlike Brandon, I'm not an expert on King per se. I certainly consider myself a student of his thought and life. And I've always tried to grapple with it as much as possible in my own work. Over the last 6 years, I've been working at the intersection of Black social movements, organized labor, progressive politics, and mainstream democratic politics. And while I've been involved nationally, I've been a more active participant and spectator of what some call the Black Lives Matter movement in Chicago, which I think is a really fascinating place for this work, given the grave realities of the Black experience in that city now and historically. Chicago famously was the site of King's only major campaign outside of the South, and where he observed firsthand the intersections of extreme de facto segregation, urban poverty, state-sanctioned economic racism, ethnic machine politics, gang violence, and police brutality, all of which continue to plague Chicago today to more or lesser degrees. So I thought it would be fitting to reference some of my experiences working there. I've been involved with the Black Lives Matter movement in Chicago and nationally since 2014. And one of my constant harping points to anyone who will listen is that, in my opinion, it is a movement that has legitimate institutional scaffolding and leadership, that there is a network of people and organizations who are responsible for its founding and for reproducing its culture, its discourse, its aims, and its distinctiveness within the long Black freedom struggle. In essence, these people and organizations should be recognized as its leadership and should be recognized as speaking for the movement. Certainly in Chicago, I think there is a rough consensus when we speak of the Black Lives Matter movement that we're speaking of a distinct set of organizations within a much broader ecosystem that attempts to represent Black interest in the city, or sometimes use the banner of Black Lives Matter to raise attention. In fact, with these other elements of the Black Lives Matter movement often find themselves in direct political conflict with these other factions, organizations, and leaders. including the city's Black political leadership, despite the universal evocation of Black Lives Matter. Organizations that I consider to be part of the Black Lives Matter movement in Chicago have names like BLM Chi, Black Youth Project 100, Assata's Daughters, Let Us Breathe Collective, Good Kid, Mad City, Soul, Black Abolition Network, and Defund CPD, the latter two being more recent coalitions formed in the wake of this summer's large-scale protest. These groups, most of which I've worked with, several of which I'm a member, gained legitimacy through their role as the lead organizers across what I consider the two essential mediums of the movement: social media and large-scale direct action, both demonstrative and civil disobedient. In essence, the legitimacy in the city was earned through painstaking and tireless work and sacrifice, and countless hours in the streets and ultimately in jail cells. I found that it was in the communal spaces forged both online and in support of such actions that most of the education, theorizing, agenda setting, and practices of self and collective care occurred, especially in the earliest iterations of the movement, which predate Ferguson. While the Black Lives Matter movement is a distributed movement characterized disproportionately by local, mostly autonomous campaigns, there is a significantly more national coordination than is publicized, primarily through an organization called Movement for Black Lives, a national organization born out of a convening in Cleveland in the summer of 2015, in which I attended. The organization recently convened what it called the National Black Convention, a virtual response to both the Democratic and Republican national conventions, which in my opinion was woefully undercovered by the media. The reason I am pressing this claim is because I want to draw a distinction between what I consider to be the Black Lives Matter movement and the broad, unwieldy, and extraordinary resonance of the Black Lives Matter brand, which I do believe is impossible to define. Like good brands, the Black Lives Matter brand is meant to evoke different emotions in its unique consumers and supporters. The Black Lives Matter brand popularity is associated with, amongst many other things, a pathos for victims of police violence, a recognition that racism and police violence are systemic rather than individual problems, and that all of us must play some role in eradicating oppressive systems. This isn't an exhaustive list, but just some of what we can gather from public opinion data. After an inauspicious beginning as a brand in earnest in 2014 after the death of Mike Brown, the Black Lives Matter brand has slowly and then dramatically risen in popularity and recognition. First, due to the election of Donald Trump and the desire of many whites to affirm or signify their opposition to him through support of racial justice, and then rapidly as a consequence of the murder of George Floyd by Minneapolis police and the unprecedented breadth and intensity of protest activity that followed. This rapid rise in popularity in the early part of the summer, which saw the Black Lives Matter brand achieve approval ratings in the 70 and 80 percentiles nationally, with almost universal support amongst liberals and the young, was clearly not lost on corporate America. We witnessed seemingly an overnight corporatization of the brand. By that, I mean, because of their huge platforms, corporations and their celebrity spokespeople and employees begin to play an outsized role in further popularizing and defining the brand of Black Lives Matter, seemingly with little concern for or participation from what I earlier described as the Black Lives Matter movement. Sometimes these efforts took the Black Lives Matter brand in completely different directions than the movement itself. Examples of such interventions include JP Morgan Chase CEO Jamie Dimon kneeling a la Kaepernick with his executive team in front of a bank vault, which might very well have been holding the residuals from the firm's centuries-old investments in the slave trade. While other corporations made more substantive and less cringeworthy statements to affirm Black Lives Matter and propose philanthropic investments and minor internal reforms, much of it felt like a bid for cheap grace. For example, Bank of America proposed a $1 billion investment in Black communities over 4 years as part of their Black Lives Matter statement, a number which sounds impressive until you remember Bank of America has over $2.1 trillion in assets and a long history of employment and lending discrimination. Some saw this corporate turn as a necessary and flawed intervention that frankly put corporate interest on the vanguard of America's racial politics. Scholar Kimberly Crenshaw offered in June that you basically have a moment where every corporation worth its salt is saying something about structural racism and anti-Blackness, and that stuff is even outdistancing what candidates in the Democratic Party were actually saying. Of course, that's not to say Democratic and a few Republican politicians weren't taking note of the brand's rise in approval rating. Regardless of their sometimes hostile or indifferent reaction to the policy demands of the Black Lives Matter movement, none of us can forget some of the performative gestures we've witnessed from leading politicians over the last several months, arguably most famously House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and other members of Congress kneeling in kente cloth stoles in the Capitol. In my own work as a political strategist, I've seen Black Lives Matter consistently included in polling and messaging surveys. While these polls rarely test the movement's narratives or policies, they do test its approval ratings, which are still sky high amongst likely Democratic voters, despite recent declines amongst moderate and conservative whites. Mostly, white consultants will then distill the support into a message that usually adopts retrograde and reformist bad apple language with regards to police, and then micro-targets these messages, which also test well, to be honest, to African-American young and white liberal voters. All of this performance becomes what I consider an erasure or an obscuring, not just of the movement's well-publicized position on policing, defund and abolish, but also and arguably more importantly of their broader agenda, which frankly is inseparable from their agenda on law enforcement. For example, in Chicago, this summer's Black Lives Matter protests have coincided with a generational spike in violent crime, itself possibly spurred by the economic and social problems caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, combined with longstanding problems almost identical to those experienced by King in '65 and '66. When committees like the Black Abolition Network and Defund CPD talk about defunding the police, they use the slogan, "Another world is possible." They know that given the realities Black people face in the city, a world without police must be an entirely different world altogether if it is to ensure the true safety and flourishing of its Black residents. Organizers in these movements are, I would say, like King, at a minimum, capitalism skeptics, if not downright anti-capitalist, and recognize and articulate the racialization and dehumanization of Black lives within the market. That said, they tend not to lean too heavily on their anti-capitalist message, in part due to the fact that most of their growth over the last several months has come from progressive young whites, many of whom are relatively highly paid professionals in the city's global services economy, and are frankly more motivated and animated by radical critiques of white supremacy and the institution of law enforcement. The other challenge they face is that Black constituencies are skeptical, in particular of the feasibility of large-scale democratic transformation, despite supporting specific policies, a problem I actually think plagued the Bernie Sanders campaign. And in Chicago, this pessimism is far more acute, given the additional layer of overcoming a relatively powerful local political machine and the crushing perception of austerity that has defined Chicago political life for decades. This reality forces the movement to be more humble on the invest side of its divest, invest framework, which goes back to the earliest days of the movement. I was involved in a campaign at the Cook County Board to pass an ordinance, non-binding, affirming the importance of Black lives in the budgeting process and the need to, in the face of more COVID-related austerity, shift any fiscally necessary cuts to the county carceral system, the jail, and the sheriff, and reinvest savings in programs that support Black flourishing, including housing, mental health, and jobs. While the ordinance passed almost unanimously through the Democratic board, we did have to face the reality that the meager investments we might deliver for these programs, while helpful, would certainly not create another world or convince many African Americans in vulnerable communities that the will existed to fundamentally transform their realities. Nationally, despite the movement being the creator of the brand, they have, in my opinion, seemed less able to capitalize on that platform than I believe they deserve. Agree or disagree with their positions, I argue that in creating this moment, they deserve to have their positions heard. And it is critical to the future of American and Black politics that we grapple with the entirety of their claims. Many of you might have heard of the Justice and Policing Act, aka the George Floyd Act, proposed in Congress and championed by the Congressional Black Caucus, is the official Democratic response to this summer's uprising, basically an array of the strongest outstanding reforms to federal policing with some incentives and implications for local departments. This is a bill that's been championed by many, including corporate interests and celebrities. What most people may not know is that the movement for Black lives is not signatory to this bill and produced their own federal legislation called the Breathe Act. 2 days ago was the virtual day of action for the bill, but in my half hour of searching, the only celebrity I saw lifting it up was comedian Amy Schumer. And frankly, that's a shame because the bill takes a totally different tact. In addition to calling for a defunding of federal law enforcement infrastructure, it calls for a whole host of economic reforms, similar to Bernie Sanders or King's agenda, but far more focused on extending benefits like universal basic income, free education, full employment, and labor organizing rights, specifically to Black and marginalized communities. The language in their bill speaks to their market skepticism. For example, it calls for federal investment in Black-owned worker co-ops, but eschews the universalist language that Bernie's movement argued was the only way to build support for such programs. To me, Given the electoral collapse of the Bernie movement, I wonder if it could actually be more likely that racially targeted expansions of the welfare state are able to win popular support. With Joe Biden's explicit rejection of Medicare for All and the Green New Deal, it's worth the question, especially since I've heard from members of the CBC that Biden has expressed a much greater willingness to consider H.R. 40, the bill to study reparations, post the election. I'll stop here and close out with a few of my own outstanding questions as I continue to grapple with this moment. How does this capitalist skeptic movement prevent its erasure by the exploitation of its own brand, such that its more substantive and fulsome claims are heard? How does a Black revolutionary movement win over Black constituents when competing with a still popular and often oppositional Black political leadership and the legacy of the failure of previous movements proposing to deliver transformational change? And finally, to reiterate, is a campaign for what I call Black social democracy actually and paradoxically a more likely vehicle for a major expansion of the welfare state than Bernie or possibly King-style multiracial working class campaigns? Stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, both of you, Brandon and Jason, for your really thoughtful and substantive remarks. There's so much to go over, I think, but in the interest of time, I'd like to start with one question, which picks up on themes that you've both touched on. But if you were both advisors to a hypothetical administration, so I'm not talking about the Biden administration necessarily, but an administration in an ideal world, what would be some of the laws or policies, like 3 to 5 key priorities, policy priorities that reflect the principles that Brandon had outlined earlier that were developed by Professor Shelby, along with the one that Brandon added on? So, would you, for example, include reparations or universal basic income? What are some kind of key policies or pillars for operationalizing those principles?
Jason, why don't you start?
Sure. Yeah, that's a tough question. There's a host of reforms. Part of it gets back to what a point I was trying to make, which is, historically, the conventional wisdom is that the best way politically to advance economic benefits to African Americans is to support universal programs that benefit everyone and try to build working class or middle class support for these expansions. And I still think that there's some credence to that. But recently, just given the overwhelming cultural capital, the willingness of different interests to kind of capitulate to some of the claims around historic racial injustice, I wonder if in the short term, there may be opportunities to move more racially targeted programs or use racially motivated argumentation for universal programs. Cory Booker, for example, has a baby bond bill that would, give folks a bond at their birth. And he argued that it would be a huge way to close the racial wealth gap and wanted to actually use that argumentation. Historically, we might think that's not the way to argue for the bill. But right now, I think it actually may be useful. So I think what we need to do is kind of take up some of those kind of legislation that I think we can kind of front load, because the political capital of the next administration is going to be thin. It's going to be time bound, obviously. And so whatever we have that's ready to go that can kind of move us forward in dealing with some of the economic problems that Brandon mentioned, I think is what we should prioritize.
So that's really interesting. So you're really talking about universal programs that could alleviate poverty, but then through those, they're not necessarily focused specifically on African Americans. But what about policies such as like reparations or, the movement to defund the police, which in a sense affects, a range of communities, but really communities of color specifically?
Well, I think, there are two questions that are really important here. So whatever the program, whatever the policy orientation, I think you have to have a prior commitment to expanding democratic power. So I think, to build on Jason's insight, which I think is right, that in a moment of intense focus on racial justice questions, we actually have a scaffolding to press really serious procedural reforms that this country needs in order to salvage democracy from basically a neo-fascist threat. You know, I thought the passing of John Lewis was a really missed opportunity to rethink the Voting Rights Act and to put a lot of pressure on people to wake up to the ways in which voter suppression has become incredibly targeted, incredibly systematic, very effective. You have the president openly calling for self-styled vigilantes to disrupt political power. And so I say that just to say that I think you need to tie these economic justice questions to the democratic empowerment that will allow people to protect them over time. Because then if you don't do that, you just create more disillusionment long term. And the second piece, which goes more to your public safety question, and it builds on this, is that, you know, as the defund the police rhetoric suggests, when you actually look at the policy proposals, it's a defund strategy that's an investment strategy elsewhere. And I think this is what Jason's really trying to convey to everyone. So for example, it's not just that, you know, people in Chicago are aware. Jason lives in Chicago. It's like people are aware of the enormous amount of violence. I'm from Baltimore. Baltimore is having a wave of murder that's higher than the crack epidemic when I was growing up, right? We know about the violence in these communities. What we are skeptical of, and rightly so, given the evidence, is that the police departments as currently constituted are equipped to deal with it. So it really is I mean, people think of it as a kind of radical, out of this world, out of the box idea, but it's a recognition of a profound systemic failure to do the basic jobs that police say that they're doing and that they deserve support for. They don't clear 50% of murders in these communities. So we need to develop other ways of mitigating violence, responding to potential retaliatory violence, people who understand the cycles of violence better than existing strategy. I mean, Jason had an exchange with the mayor of Chicago that was all about this, that the mayor of Chicago is saying things about the violence in the streets that would be true in the 1990s and don't map onto the shifts that have happened with drill music, the circulation of YouTube videos that are about, you know, pushing gang rivalries. So we need a much more community-focused public safety programs, a set of public safety programs that are driven by that democratic ethos.
And I'll just add into just 2 sentences just to get more. Yes, I support, I think we should pass the HR 40 reparations bill to open up that conversation and try to take into account of these historical harms. And as it relates to federal law enforcement policy, I've been arguing for years that really a focus on the federal government as it relates to law enforcement policy is a mistake. The federal government controls too small of a percentage of the law enforcement and carceral regime, and that really needs to happen in the states and in the local jurisdictions. And doing that, we have to listen to what Brandon was just saying, is that in our urban environments, we need to focus on the investment that we're going to use to replace these broken law enforcement systems.
So you've touched on the role of federal government and states, and earlier you talked about corporate capture of brands, but really, as you look at the privatization of not just prisons, but also all of the allied businesses like the provision of cell phone, telephone services in prisons or other kinds of, services. How does, what are your thoughts about holding such companies as well accountable and following that trail of money?
Well, I think it's especially important to take the response that Jason outlined, the wave of corporations seeking to make Black Lives Matter their landing page or produce Black Lives Matter content. And, one of the projects I'm working with King Boston, a local group in the Carr Center for Economic Democracy, is compiling all of these statements, right? So to really compile all these statements, understand the corporations that issued them, and then be able to develop a activist profile right? So that people can target them to live up to the things that they said they would do. They are now vulnerable in the commitments that they've made. Now that's going to take democratic power. It's going to take being able to call on politicians to enforce these kinds of acts. But they've opened up a vulnerability that's unprecedented in the history of corporate America. And as King noted, that should be a site of economic justice as well, to contest and disrupt those companies if they can't be made to live up to their own ideals, professed ideals.
So we have a question from our audience about how you see the legacy of the Black Panther Party in today's movement for Black lives. Jason, do you want to take that?
Yeah, so I'm glad that question came up, because I actually kind of wanted to talk about it, but obviously I wanted to be resident of time. The Black Panther movement looms large as a kind of both an aesthetic and ideological source of inspiration. You know, part of what the Black Lives Matter movement is trying to do is rethink both models of leadership. You know, you've heard this term of leaderful movements, but also kind of queering or bringing a kind of feminine or care ethic to how we think about leadership. And they're, you know, one of the things that people miss is that this movement is not, despite being, you know, a leaderful movement, they're not anti-recognition. In fact, on the contrary, they often are very interested in making sure that women, particularly queer women who are in leadership, are lifted up and recognized for their leadership as presenting a new model for what that looks like historically. And so one of the, you know, some of the inspirations for this are radical Black women activists who were part of the Black Panther movement. Angela Davis, Sada Shakur loom large, both in their writings and also guess kind of their liturgy of their performance. And from an agenda standpoint, if you go back to 2016, many of the writers of the Vision for Black Lives noted that one of their starting places was the Black Panthers' 10-point plan. And they went through that and kind of tried to organize their claims, because again, they knew that this policing and police violence issue was only one part of a much broader revolution of our society that would be required to achieve Black equality. And lastly, I'll just say, as it relates to King, one of the things that I find is interesting is King is kind of used as kind of a, you know, break in the case of emergency. You know, they tend to use King when they're under immense pressure, but they don't tend to use him consistently as a reference point, despite the fact, as Brandon illuminated, King had a lot of the content that they're interested in within his repertoire and within his philosophy. So I think that's an interesting point. I wonder if that might shift as work like Brandon's becomes more popularized and there's kind of a reimagination of King opposed to the kind of commercialized, you know, position that he's been put in subsequent.
So another question from the audience that, do you have optimism around bringing what they refer to as moderate Americans who want to fight racism, but don't see themselves as radical activists, given the way the media portrays the Black Lives Matter movement? What are ways in which you can engage more mainstream, the mainstream public, I guess?
Well, I think here, I'll give you one reason for optimism and one reason to be very, very concerned. The optimistic reason is that I and a number of other people have been sounding the bell for the last few years that something dramatic is going on with younger white Americans. These are people who've grown up largely under Barack Obama, had enormous hopes for his presidency that they've then seen disappointed. They've been exposed to a much broader range of Black commentators, Black intellectuals, anti-racist thought in college, in the media, in music and art, right? You know, this is a generation whose horror movie experiences are not the ones I grew up on, but are Get Out, right? Or Lovecraft County, excuse me. That has put questions of racial justice and the question of complicity as much more of a central existential issue for them. And it's existential in a very important way, that it's about the scripts of how you want to live a good life. How do you want to engage as a citizen in the public realm? And one of the ways we can see their revolt against the old scripts of heroism is in the attack on naming rituals and Confederate statues, attempt to overthrow the symbolism which suggests that those icons of the past are important repositories or touchstones of who we should want to be in the present. That gives me a lot of confidence, because I think those attitudes, those dispositions are going to be durable in lots of respects. And those people are going to come with a much bigger base of information than white generations in the past from which to draw from their judgments about racial justice questions. The thing that concerns me is that right now it's very difficult to disentangle a lot of what people are committed to from their opposition to Donald Trump. So if Donald Trump is removed from the picture, where do people slot out in their commitments to, or their willingness to be identified with what are already being framed as kind of a quote unquote Black radicalism? That's the question haunting us in the moment, and one of the things that I think we'll only see after the election.
So I know we're almost out of time, but I'm wondering, given the impact, the disproportionate impact of the coronavirus on Black Americans, both in terms of economic status and in terms of health, what are your thoughts in terms of a recovery plan, and what are ways in which to ensure that we don't just kind of repeat the mistakes of the past and perpetuate past inequities? How do we ensure a more robust and resilient recovery?
Yeah, that's a great question. I encourage everyone to go to the Movement for Black Lives website and look at their COVID demands, because they actually laid out a very interesting agenda to address these concerns. And in a nutshell, what they were talking about was, we have to make this recovery people-focused and not corporate focused. So much of our recovery programs, going back to the Great Recession, were about subsidization of banks, kind of these capital investment programs that filtered through different corporate vendors, et cetera. And what they were talking about is, we have to have financial relief for individuals. We have to have direct transfer to individuals. We have to have an increase in wages for those who are forced to work in the midst of the pandemic. And we need to have universal programs that ensure that all of the needs that arise from the pandemic, housing, healthcare, are now taken care of by our federal government. And obviously they were focusing on the marginal community, but in this particular plan, these kind of policies would have far-ranging benefits beyond the Black community. One of the things that I wished had happened is, at the height of the Black Lives Matter movement's political capital, if there had been a way to actually combine them with efforts to increase and improve the recovery programs, and kind of been able to leverage some of that political capital in that moment. Because I could see a scenario in which, I know we don't want to talk about Joe Biden, but I could see a scenario in which Joe Biden feels far more motivated and responsible delivering for his Black constituency than he does for a left constituency, and can get to some of these things through the pressure put on by those that delivered him the White House, as opposed to those put on from a broader left flank. And so I kind of hope that I see those things merge. And finally, I'll say that investments in our local and state governments through the HEROES Act is critical for African Americans, because African American employment is disproportionately leveraged to the public sector. I think it's another thing that Black Lives Matter can lead on, the movement, not just the brand. The movement can lead if given the opportunity.
Yeah, just to add, I mean, Jason's 100% right on that. I think there is a confusion that people often have about who's the most disproportionately affected by COVID. And while many poor African Americans are disproportionately affected because of the density in which they live, there's actually a lot of working class and professional African Americans who, because they work for the government, are not able to socially distance. And so they're actually being made to bear the cost of social reproduction during the pandemic. And if you look at well-off Black suburbs like Prince George's County or Montgomery County in Maryland, who have kind of a high concentration of Black government employees, you actually see really high COVID numbers there as well. And so we need to focus on taking care of government workers who are forced to or compelled to provide services for the rest of us in this time. And we also need, I think one other thing that the movement for Black Lives is very good on is immediate decarceration. Prisons are wildly unsafe in the age of COVID. They were wildly unsafe before, but this has just made it indefensible and glaringly so for many people who are currently incarcerated to stay there any longer. It serves no public safety prerogative. It is a bad public health prerogative. And we need a dramatic and immediate decarceration of many people who are vulnerable to COVID while incarcerated.
Unfortunately, we're out of time. I think we could continue this conversation for a while, but thank you so much, Brandon and Jason, and thank you, Mathias, for getting us started today. And thank you to our audience for joining us. Look forward to continuing conversations with you at the Carr Center. Tomorrow, we're hosting a conversation with Keisha Blaine as part of her Social Justice Leaders series, where she's interviewing someone from Amnesty Brazil. And next week, we'll be talking with Saru Jayaraman on the restaurant industry and the conditions facing low-wage workers in the service industry. So thank you all for joining us and take care.